Welcome to the Grow Podcast. I'm Pastor Mike with New Hope Network. We're here to help you take your next step in your relationship with Jesus. I'm so glad you're with us today.
What's up, New Hope family? Welcome back to the Grow Podcast. It is episode 51 of the Grow Podcast. I'm very glad you're here. If you missed our last episode, make sure you go back and check it out. Quick spoiler alert, we're recording that episode after this episode, so we're not going to reference any of the fun stuff from episode 50 specifically. Yes. But it was a fun episode. I'm positive.
And I'm nervous after the fact,
Pastor
because
Mike's
we haven't done it. I
Pastor Mike's
have no
performance
idea what's coming.
In episode 51 may be worse because he doesn't know what's happening in episode 50.
Yeah, I'm a little nervous about this.
Check that one out. But for now, it's episode 51, and Pastor Mike is with me as always. My name is David. I'm our online campus director. We're glad to have you here. How you doing,
That's
Pastor
fair.
Mike?
Good.
You got your Oakwoo polo
I do.
on.
I'm representing.
Go
Eagles.
Sports team. Eagles. I should
It's
have
a
guessed.
Christian college.
Christian school.
Pretty much
always
all of
Eagles
them.
first, Saints second.
Was that your alma
safe.
mater? Was it Saints or was it
No,
Eagles?
I did coach at a Christian school that was the
Okay.
Saints, but no, we were. Well, it's not my alma mater, but where I went for most of my college career, we were the Storm, which is a shame.
The oncoming storm.
The Crown College Storm. They were the Crown College Purple Storm.
Huh. I was not aware. That's where my folks went 2 years ago, but I wasn't aware of that.
St. Paul Bible College.
Yes.
And they were the Crusaders.
BB. Yes.
And they were the Crusaders when my parents went there too. And then I think, it's a Christian Missionary Alliance school, and so a heavy emphasis on overseas missions.
Yeah.
And so they'd send these missions teams to the Middle East wearing shirts that said Crusaders on them, and they're like, maybe
might not
maybe
be culturally appropriate. Yeah.
So they switched it in I want to say the late 90s, because I grew up and they were still the Crusaders, and it kind of switched over elementary school, junior high-ish. And somehow they landed on Purple Storm.
You know what I'm looking forward to right now? Because you just referenced this. We're going to get an email this week from Tom Lundeen. That will be, because that happens once in a while. And I appreciate them, but they always make me smile. Like this page email explaining the history of this. And I'm looking forward to it, and I expect it. So I'm just putting him on
I think
notice
one of his
right now.
former youth pastors, Matt Archer, who's now a senior pastor somewhere in New York or something, but he was at Crown during the switch. And so I remember him once telling me the story. I don't know if he was involved in like designing the logo or just voting on it or whatever, but it was bad. Then they switched to the Storm, but they, like 2 years ago, they stayed the Storm, but they switched their mascot to a polar bear. Couldn't tell you why. But then literally like a month ago, they announced they're the Crown College Polars now, which is much better. It's a much better
For Minnesota,
move. Yeah.
That makes sense.
But it was a dark time.
Yeah.
In the Storm era, which was my era.
I was going to say, how do you do a mascot on the field for Storm? Is it like a cloud with a lightning bolt?
It was like a hurricane.
And so you dress up like a cloud?
No, the mascot, there was a mascot when I was there, and it was just this guy.
Okay.
And he didn't come out very often.
Okay. I put at the top of our notes, let's talk about odd stuff, because that's what we talk about. And actually, this is odder than what I was expecting, because this episode will actually air the day after Father's Day.
Yes. Happy Father's Day, Pastor Mike.
Yeah, we just referred to your father,
we did.
Tom Lundeen, who I love hearing from and joins us every week.
We'll see if you love hearing from him after we record episode 50.
Oh, after episode 50, because I was say with this one, yeah. But Father's Day, do you have like Father's Day traditions?
Not necessarily a tradition. It's kind of the same. I think, was it Easter? You asked me the same question. And like as a pastor's kid, it's a Sunday. So you go. But I think as I became an adult, when we still lived in Minnesota, Father's Day usually ended up at me and my dad at a baseball game, going to a Twins game.
Nice. And when the Twins won 1 out of every 10 times.
All right. That was uncalled for. No, when I first became an adult, mid 20 odds, the Twins were very good. So that was a great time to be going to Twins games. And then it became a dark time again for a while. But, we suffer together. It's his fault. He raised me as a Twins fan in the 90s. So I saw a lot of losing baseball growing up. So now I can repay him by bringing him to more losing baseball. What about you? Do you guys do anything specific?
We typically, we've kind of switched both Father's Day and Mother's Day to the day before or to a different day, since it's on Sunday for us, and both Kylie and I are pastors. So we love to hike, so a lot of times we'll go outside if the weather's nice.
Yeah.
Typically go and do something like that. We'll pull the camper out if we can. And most of the time it involves a nice big piece of cholesterol-causing red meat steak on the grill. And I'm going to miss, our oldest son is incredible on the grill, and he's not home this year, so
Ian
I'll
has
miss
to step it up.
Yeah. Yeah. And he's much more health conscious,
Ian
so we'll
could
see.
act like he's really good at the grill, and I bet it would be very believable.
He's actually, both of them are great cooks. Brendan just has probably more experience on the grill.
Yeah.
But those are the kinds of things we do.
I don't know if food is really tied to Father's Day as much as Mother's Day. Because Mother's Day, we would always try to go to, whatever, brunch or whatever, after church or whatever. And that was like a main focus of it. Whereas I don't know, I might be remembering wrong, but I don't feel like we usually went out to eat on Father's Day growing up.
Huh. For us, most of it's outside stuff.
Right.
Mother's Day.
You grill.
Yeah. And even Mother's Day for us, and we're in North Dakota, so we shifted a couple weeks. That's where we go and buy all the outdoor flowers for our yard and plant them all together. We kind of do that. For Father's Day, I know I'm weird. I love yard work. I love that kind of thing. So we'll go out and do those kinds of things.
You're my boss, so I'm not going to comment on if you are or
but I know
not
what
weird.
you're thinking. But yeah.
Well, shall we dive into our topic for the week?
Sure.
You go ahead. I'm sorry. No, you took your deep I'm about to talk breath, and I interrupted you, and I feel terrible about it.
Well, we finished up this last weekend in a little different way for Father's Day. We finished up our Multiplied series.
Yeah. Super cool series.
We got to hear from all three of our church planters, and then we capped it off yesterday with really asking and answering the question, why are we multiplying?
Yep.
And it really comes down to, for us, and I didn't say this weekend, but it really comes down to maturity. God wants to grow us up, and in maturity, he wants us to multiply the faith. And so that's part of what I want to talk about today is maturity in maybe a little bit different way than we're used to. But since it was Father's Day yesterday, I want to start with a question. A lot of time, last week, episode 50 at least, you got to ask me the questions. So this is not a revenge question, but this is another question. But as you watch your kids, what are some of the things you watch for that are indicative of their current level of maturity? And if you're joining us, just you can write it down or
just scream really loud so that we find out if we can hear you or not. Speaking of which, that does tie in a bit to our Father's Day video. So if you didn't see that with us this weekend, first of all, go watch the service, but you can see our Father's Day video on our YouTube channel because it is a little bit related to maturity. Because Michael and I made it, so there's not a lot of maturity involved.
It's related more to immaturity.
But I mean, there's like the big staples, right? Like as your kid gets like potty trained, for instance, things like that. I think a big thing we learned with Leighton was when he could respond to like punishment or consequences, not necessarily immediately. Like he's still 4, so it still takes. But once you get to the point where you can actually have a conversation of, this is what you did, so this is why this is happening. And even though it makes you mad, and it's okay that it makes you mad, but there are consequences to our actions. Whereas with Matilda, she just turned 2. We're still at the point where she does something wrong and there's consequences, and she just she can't comprehend like why there have to be consequences. I just did what I wanted to do. So I think that's a big one. Like
understanding, awareness, those kinds of things.
Yeah, awareness would be a big one. Yeah,
I mean we tend to, especially with as human beings with kids, we tend to kind of equate understanding with maturity. But it's interesting, as we get older, we kind of switch, because we know a lot of people who understand a lot of things who aren't necessarily the most mature people in the world. And what's so fascinating to me in the church world and in Christianity is we call, there's maturity, and then we call it what? Spiritual maturity.
Sure. Classic church phrase.
Yeah, it is. And the question that I've always wrestled with is, how do we separate those two? And I understand why, because we kind of think of it as a relationship with God. But, and we probably need to talk about this at another time. We've referred to it from time to time. Even though there are different parts of us, there is our spirit, there is our mind or our soul, and there is our flesh, our body. Those are 3 different parts. But they're so closely connected, we can't separate those two. My emotions, what's happening in my mind, can be affected by what I had on my pizza last night. and the same thing, my spirit can be affected by how much sleep I've gotten lately, or what I'm focusing my mind on. So we need to be very careful to talk that we aren't talking about spiritual maturity different than the other kinds of maturity. They're connected, but there are definitely some different things. Go ahead.
Do you think we do that because, like, someone who's not a Christ follower, we wouldn't consider to have any spiritual maturity, if they're completely separate from God? Then it's hard. Are you saying just anybody who doesn't know the Lord is an extremely immature person?
Not necessarily, because I think we can have some spiritual maturity, and it depends on, we'll look in a minute how the Bible describes spiritual maturity. But this is just one of those things, I think, where we talk about spiritual maturity because of the necessity of vocabulary.
Sure.
We have to have some way to describe it, but our vocabulary doesn't fully describe it, particularly in English. Other languages, like we've talked about before, have more specific words, and we have more specific words in some ways than other languages do. So it's just probably a lack of specificity in our language.
Not in our language, where we use the same word for like 5 different things that mean completely different.
I was writing something today, and I found myself going back to high school and going, okay, which 2 is this? Is this T-O? Is this T-O? And I spent a good 10 minutes and finally, what am I doing? The only person who's going to read this is me. Who cares?
Well, your old English teacher was very proud.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about what the Bible says about maturity?
I want to take us to a few things here. Ephesians 4:13 talks about the unity of the faith, knowledge of God, and, catch this, an increase in stature. Now, different people have referred to that different way. Is that physical stature? Really, the word that's used here is character, how people perceive your character or standing. Stable in convictions, speaking truth with love. And he talks about all of these. He lists all of those things, and he says, basically, this is how you grow up into all aspects of who God wants you to be and who God is. Colossians 1:28, which is part of our mission here at New. It was part of my mission too. It uses the word fully mature, which is the Greek word teleos, which is a real fascinating word because it means complete without missing anything, but it doesn't mean complete as in finished product. It's kind of like, I put your son puts a Lego thing together and it's like, it's complete, but we all know Legos can always be added to, right?
Yeah.
But it's complete within itself. It's where you're supposed to be right now. Colossians 2 later on talks about maturity in terms of being firmly rooted, in other words, being stable. 1 Corinthians 2 equates maturity to having a wisdom that is above the world's conventional thinking, what the world considers to be normal. 1 Corinthians 2 says, no, if you're spiritually mature, you have a wisdom that understands at a higher level. 1 Corinthians 14 says, and I love this one, you don't think like a child anymore.
Interesting.
And it just leaves it there for you to fill in the blanks.
Yeah.
Romans 12, which might be like, it's like my chocolate chip cookie, the Bible, because, the chocolate chip cookie is like the standard dessert, right? So it's, for most people.
It's about as good as it gets.
In Romans chapter 12, I memorized it when I was in middle school, still have it in my head almost word for word. And I just call
that's how we're going to finish the podcast.
There you go.
He's going to do the whole chapter.
I just call it the maturity chapter because it starts out talking about what we offer our bodies as a living sacrifice, talks about our minds being transformed and renewed, talks about having a right perspective of yourself, talks about knowing what your spiritual gift is and using it, talks about emotional intelligence in relationships and how we interact with people. And I love how it ends. And leave revenge to God. Because that's an immature thing, right? Where it's like, I'm going to get even. So, the Bible, it's not like it lists, here's the silver bullet of maturity for us. But what's and I keep saying what's interesting, because this is something I've studied for years, thought about for years, and so I've been excited for this particular episode, and I'm going to try and keep it more concise, but we'll come back to this. What's so interesting is when we think of maturity, especially outside of spiritual circles, but when we think of it in terms of relationships, we think of it in terms of maturity, in terms of relational maturity, emotional intelligence. That's kind of a key buzzword buzz phrase these years. Physical growth. If your children aren't growing physically, there's some questions there. But so when we talk about maturity, we tend to think about those things. But when we talk about spiritual maturity, most people equate it to knowledge. And the Bible certainly says that knowledge is a part of it, but it actually minimizes it. And especially in the New Testament, it's filled with examples of people that have a high amount of knowledge, but are not described as being spiritually mature.
How do you think that became our misunderstanding of quote unquote spiritual maturity?
That's a great question. I probably have my theories. I don't know that I have answers there too. One, it's an easy metric.
Sure. Yeah.
And two, if I can repeat a lot of stuff, and if I can say a lot of phrases or repeat a lot of verses, I sound what? I sound better. Yeah. So we tend to equate that knowledge with maturity. But it's a little bit like, the 11 or 12-year-old or 13-year-old that has such a high IQ. They're already in high school or college, but are they relationally mature?
Well, it's almost the Pharisees and teachers of the law during Jesus' time would have seen themselves as being the most spiritually mature because they had that knowledge, and that's why they were elevated in the spiritual side of things in that culture at the top. But yeah, when you look at the other areas of things, they certainly weren't where they needed to be.
And we like to look at things that are easy to measure, and here's the key: compare, right? But go ahead.
There's a great comedian, John Christ, who we're familiar with, and you often use the comparison. What is it? Comparison is the thief of joy.
Yeah. It's not original with me, but
and he brought it up in his comedy special.
I haven't watched that.
Yeah, and he says that, and then he just kind of looks at the camera and he goes, "Depends on who you compare yourself to."
Okay, not wrong.
That was pretty good, but a joke.
Yeah,
it's a joke.
Scripture consistently puts one thing at the top of the list. I mean, we went through all these things, but it consistently puts one thing at the top of the list as an indicator of maturity. And yet it's not the thing that we tend to go to first. Several years ago, there were several deep dive and surveys on this and trying to measure and get a handle on, are people just attending church or are they really growing up in church? And there were some great studies, and some of them, there's some great books on it. A lot of them kind of put this thing on a continuum, like it's easy to measure, 0 to 10.
Sure.
But they kind of use this as a measure of where people are at spiritually. 0 being a person who really gives no thought to God. So not a follower of Jesus. That would be like 5 is the way they do it. So there's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 of that progression towards that moment when they become a follower of Jesus and ask Jesus to forgive them of their sins. And then 10 would be like Colossians 1:28, teleos, as where you need to be right now. So spiritually mature. And there's a lot we could talk about with that. But what was so groundbreaking and shocking to all those that did this deep dive in these studies on this is that most followers of Jesus got stuck in the 7 to 8 range. In fact, most felt like they hit a ceiling and almost regressed back. And they tend to react by getting, and maybe this is you, maybe you've grown up in church, by getting disillusioned with church. Or, you know what, I'm just not getting what I need from this church, and so we move to a new church. In fact, that's the number one reason people cite for having to move to a new church is not being offended, although that's certainly part of some of it. It's maturing Christians who say, you want to guess the phrase? I'm not getting
fed.
Which
is a much better reason to pick a new restaurant than a new church.
But you think about
Thank you, producer, for laughing at that one.
I was focused. I wasn't going to laugh at that. Do you ever think about the maturity of that statement? I'm not getting fed. Who gets fed? 1-year-olds, infants, or on the other end, when you no longer can.
Yep.
And yet that tends to be where we get stuck.
Yeah.
And at that moment, many people back away from the very things that are designed to mature. And so people begin to dig into the difference and what causes this kind of spiritual ceiling. And it really amounted to one question that most people don't even realize they're asking, but they're bumping up against. Is my faith in Jesus, is my following Jesus about what I'm getting, or is it about what I'm giving? Is it, and they put it this way, is it about me, kind of my ROI, return on investment, or is it really about Jesus? Now, we will say that intellectually, but we all hit this ceiling.
Sure.
And we struggle with this. In Wesleyan circles or in kind of holiness circles, if you're familiar with those terms, we call it, we use the biblical term, there's this moment of kind of sanctification or surrender. Like Romans 12 talks a lot about that. But you think about this. The number one reason that people get to a point where they struggle with praying after they've been a follower of Jesus for a while is they say, I'm not getting anything out of it, or God's not answering my prayers. And we'll say it's other reasons, but if we're real honest, it's that one. Number one reason that we don't serve or we stop serving is what? It's inconvenient. I don't feel like I'm getting out of it what I'm putting into it. You hear what we're saying here? Number one reason we don't tithe or we stop giving. I'm not getting a return, or the church isn't acting the way that I think they should act. Number one reason we don't engage in spiritual disciplines or we stop them, like fasting and all that, is I tried and I didn't get something out of it. And Scripture makes it clear that maturity doesn't work that way. I mean, Jesus gave us the two greatest commandments, right? Love the Lord your God and love other people as yourself. Now, he's not saying let people walk over you. He's not saying don't take care of yourself. So, don't go to that extreme.
Yeah.
But when we start saying that it's about, my return on investment first, and if I don't get that, then obviously, something's not worth the investment here. We're in trouble. In Romans chapter 12, if you read down through that, maybe that might be part of your homework this week. It has to do with moving out of this mindset and focusing on others than anything else.
Is that why you think we commonly refer to it as like the prosperity gospel?
Yeah.
That has the appeal of that, the mass appeal of that, particularly in our modern culture where we are constantly looking for a return on investment, where, well, if I'm giving this, what am I getting back? And you go somewhere where it's well, if you give this, then you'll get you'll for sure get specifically this back, as opposed to, having it be a part of your growth in your relationship with Christ.
Yeah. And it's so much like even though the Pharisees, Sadducees weren't necessarily the prosperity gospel, but when we start getting disillusioned with this and we hit this ceiling and we don't break through it, we'll start looking for substitutes. So whether it's knowledge, I want to go to a church where they teach a certain way, that makes, like, they've got to teach verse by verse, or it's not really, whatever, or the prosperity gospel thing, it's got to be about what I get. And this is what's so hard about this is to break us through this is kind of squishy. It's not like, here's the one thing you need to do.
It's a Pastor Kylie term you just used.
Yes,
there.
I've been around my wife for a long time. It's not like I can say, here's the one thing.
Sure.
It takes surrender. For a lot of us, it takes time because we don't realize how stinking selfish we are. How Kylie and I talk about this often where we'll get frustrated with someone, and kind of my phrase, and she'll roll her eyes. She said, I know it, and it sounds so cynical, is we always forget how self-absorbed all of us are. All of us, because we really are. And we've grown up in it. It was born in us because Adam and Eve passed it on to all of us. Bless their hearts. We're all going to line up and have a conversation with them when we get to heaven. We just don't recognize it in ourselves because we're so used to it that it takes time for us to begin to recognize this. And so we get stuck. And so it takes recognition. It takes it takes engaging in things that retrain our thinking. Romans 12:2, don't be conformed to the patterns of this world any longer. In other words, what we assume to be normal, but be transformed by the what? Renewing of your mind. And then you'll know what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And then you read what happens next. A lot of people, we know that one.
Right.
But what happens next? He said, don't think more highly of yourself than you ought. Right. And we tend to think of it in terms of ego, but it's not always ego. It's in terms of self. Self. Is this about me or is this about Jesus? And that's the ceiling.
You have homework for us this week?
I do. I'm going to offer 3 different things, and you choose one. You like the multiple options. One, read Romans 12 and just mark down, listen for it. Yeah. 2, here's a question to ask in your quiet time. Just ask God, is there anything holding me back from taking my next step with you? Okay, so Romans 12, or ask anything back from taking my next step with you. Or here's a third question. Ask God and even do some reflection. What have I stopped, avoided, or gotten offended by that's actually a result of thinking it's about me instead of about you, Jesus? And if something comes up, to put a name to it. Okay, that's where I'm immature. Let's just be honest about who we are. Okay?
That'll be a fun one.
Yeah, all 3 of those are fun.
How immature I am.
Reading Romans 12 is probably the most fun one of the 3, right? But
all right.
Let's start.
Thank you, Pastor Mike. And we say it every week on the Grow podcast, but growth always starts with the next step. So let's make sure that we do one of those homeworks, and we will have the 3 different homework options in the description or the podcast notes, so you can find those. We're going to try to be better about having like a summary or not forgetting to put the things in the podcast notes when we need to put them in there. And the homework is going to be something we'll try to have up there every week. Thank you to Andrew for asking us to be better with that.
Yep.
Andrew was right.
Good.
And so we will try to be better with that. And thank all of you for being here with us. We really enjoy the Grow podcast. It's been a year as of the next Grow podcast. We've been doing this for a year.
That's crazy.
Hopefully we'll have another fun year of Grow podcasts. But thank you guys for being here with us. Make sure you join us on the weekend for our new upcoming series, Take a Hike. It's going to be awesome. Pastor Mike's going to hike the whole time.
Actually,
we just watch him hike.
New Hope here.
There is hiking
online.
Involved.
There will be hiking involved.
True. In person?
In person, no.
What if we build you, like a really small hill? Will you just hike it?
And go up and down the whole time?
Let us know. Send an email.
The messages might be shorter because I'll be out of it.
Pastor.mike at newhopewilliston.com if you would like him to hike on stage in person. But until then, we will see you next week. Thanks, everyone.